While economics sit at the heart of Ukraine's current political divide between Russia and the European Union, other factors also come into play. And joining us to talk more about all of that, Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow at the Center on Peace and Liberty, part of the Independent Institute. The new prime minister says he sees his country's future lying with the European Union, but still friendly ties with Russia. That's the best of both worlds. It's straddling both universes, which is a pretty tough needle to thread, especially when you have Russian forces kind of going through exercises there on the border with Ukraine. How likely is that?
Well, the West has deeper financial pockets, but the Russians are closer and can project military power, as we've seen with these exercises. So that's the rub for the government of the Ukraine. They've got to keep both sides happy. And also, of course, the West aid comes with strings attached, structural economic reform, and the people of the Ukraine aren't going to like that. So it's going to be a tough road there. We don't know what's going to happen. Revolutions usually go in several cycles, as we've seen in Egypt. So just because in the Russian Revolution in 1917 had a couple of rounds, so it's not over till it's over.
Let's talk about the austerity. I mean, this is a country on the verge of financial collapse. You know, people may be celebrating we've got a change in government, but they're not going to be celebrating the road ahead because it's going to be tough, isn't it? Austerity, as you mentioned.
Well, you've got austerity. The economy's in shambles. It's declining. No foreign exchange left in the coffers. The treasury's empty. And on top of that, you may have the Russian areas want to secede, like Crimea.
And then you've got Yanukovych, who's maintaining he's still the president, that this is a people's coup. Is there any likelihood of a reverse, or are we likely to see, I mean, we do see Crimea where it's kind of leaning towards Russia. Can there be a splintering?
Well, I don't think Yanukovych can come back. His support, even in the south and the southeastern Russian-speaking parts of the country, sort of evaporated to some extent. But there's still a lot of affinity for Russia, and yes, those parts could secede.
What do you think he's going to say since he's talking about having a news conference tomorrow? What are we likely to hear from him?
Well, he's kind of a blusterer anyway, so I think he's going to still declare that he's the president, which he's already done, and say that, you know, there are hoodlums and terrorists running Ukraine. And so, you know, I don't, it's sort of empty rhetoric unless the Russians invade and put him back in power, which I think is unlikely at this point.
Does that stir the pot, though? I mean, if you have some people who are agitating in Crimea, does that make the situation worse, or?
Well, the Russians, if we remember the war in Georgia, whenever there's ethnic Russian speakers, which there were in regions of Georgia, the Russians are very happy to protect them. The same way in the U.S., we go, if there's Americans threatened somewhere, we take our Navy and rescue them, and the Russians are the same way. And so I think that is a problem, and they have a big naval base there. There's military forces in Ukraine and Crimea already. So
next chapter, what do you think is the next chapter for Ukraine?
Well, it's hard to say. I think there's probably going to be more trouble. There's probably going to be more revolution, and I think there's going to be a lot of unhappiness with the austerity that's going to be needed, no matter who's in power and no matter what orientation, whether they go with Russia or looks like now they may go with the European Union at this point.
Ivan Eland, always a pleasure to have you on the broadcast. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.